This is your city. This is your city wants to know. We want to know the background, the heartbeat of what makes up our beautiful cities. We dig into the backstories, from the struggles to the successes of our local entrepreneurs, small business owners, artists, not-for-profit organizations, and the many, many people who make up the intricate tapestry of our communities. Real people, real stories, by you and for you. But wait, that's not it. I love giving my opinion. Just ask anyone who knows me. We can't get enough of the honest, gritty feedback of places that we spend our hard-earned money. I'll give you the good, the bad, and the ugly of the places I eat, sleep, and visit. Disclaimer, my opinion only. All right, so come on, let's get to it. Hey everyone, Kim here from This Is Your City. I just thought I'd do a quick intro here because our guest, Nigel Beckles, will be in a two-part series. This is part one. Nigel has so much to offer and so much to say as an expert in abusive relationships. He's an author, co-founder of Abusive Relationships, Reflections on Abusive Relationships. He has a lot to offer, so tune in next week for part two, when we delve into the narcissistic personalities of abusive relationships, which he's also an expert in. So thank you for tuning in. This is part one. Hello and welcome, and thank you once again for tuning in to This Is Your City. As always, I am Kimberly Wardell, your host. Today's guest, I have to tell you, an amazing resume. This man's accomplishments are outstanding. Let me just tell you a few things about him before I introduce him to you. He's an author. He has a book called How to Avoid Making the Big Relationship Mistakes. And being published this year, he has another book coming out called How to Avoid Abusive Relationships, a guide to toxic personalities. But that's not it. He's not just an author. I don't even want to say just an author, but he's also a qualified radio presenter. He's been a radio host for many years, online advisor. He's also kind of been an actor, really. He calls it contribution. I call it he acted in a documentary. He played himself. It's an award-winning documentary movie, Looking for Love. It's out on DVD, and you can also get it on Amazon Prime, which is amazing. Check it out, Looking for Love. He's also a member of Survivor Provider Services. This is dedicated to helping support professionals and organizations, provide information regarding victims and survivors of abusive relationships. He helps and he provides support for that. He's a co-founder of Reflections on Abusive Relationships. The acronym for that is ROAR, like a lion, R-O-A-R, Reflections of Abusive Relationships. He's also got a support group. It's for victims and survivors of abuse, and it's over 21,000 members on Facebook. So later on, we'll get the information for that if you wanted to check it out and reach out to him. Nigel Beckles is my guest. Nigel Beckles, hi, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. How are you today?
Hi, Kimberly. Yes, I'm fine. Great to be with you.
Wow, that's an impressive resume.
Thank you.
Impressive resume. And we will get to it, I promise you. But I like to do things just a little bit differently. I like to kind of rewind, go a little bit backwards. So if you don't mind, I'd like to go back in time just a little bit. So for our listeners, so they get to know you a little bit. Now,
No, that's fine.
Yeah. So with that introduction, you have conquered so many goals in your life. You're continuing to dream and conquer. You have drive, but that had to come from somewhere. So Nigel, take me back to little Nigel, young Nigel as a child, as a teenager. What kind of child was Nigel Beckles?
Well, a curious child. I'm still curious up till now. But I grew up in a home where I did witness domestic violence and domestic abuse. And that did have an impact on me as an adult, in terms of trying to work out what was right, what was wrong. And instinctively, I know the difference between right and wrong, but at the same time, you're kind of growing up in an environment where there's domestic violence. You're never sure what's going to happen next. It's a very insecure environment for a child. On top of that, one of my parents had very strong narcissistic traits. And if you grow up with a parent who's narcissistic, then you're more likely to be conditioned to accept toxic behavior as acceptable behavior. And as an adult, you're more likely to fall prey to a narcissistic abuser because you're conditioned to accept toxic behavior as being normal. So
you grew up in a relationship witnessing abuse and narcissistic, a parent who had narcissistic tendencies. What were you as a child, as a teenager, dealing with that? Were you athletic? Did you join the arts? How did you deal with that? And how did you put yourself into something else so that it didn't consume you?
Well, as a teenager, I actually started to do martial arts. Subconsciously, the objective was to protect my mother, because when the violence occurred, I would try and protect my mum. Obviously, being a small child, I used to get thrown aside and probably a little bit abused myself. So I started martial arts probably when I was about 11 years old. And I was obsessed. I was Bruce Lee obsessed. Anything Bruce Lee could do, I wanted to be able to do. 2-finger press ups, flips, back flips, etc. So that kind of consumed quite a lot of my life, actually, when I think back now, because I would train every day. I was going to maybe 3 or 4 martial art classes per week.
And that's where you were expelling all of that energy that was coming from your house.
Yeah. And I was, studying different styles, practicing different styles, like judo, karate, kung fu, taekwondo.
You still do it?
I wish. I wish. I still try and keep relatively fit, but then I've also been quite, I wouldn't say intellectual, but I've always enjoyed writing and I've always enjoyed research. In my late teens, I joined a band at school, a musical band, reggae band. So I used to write the songs, because I was like co-lead singer. So I used to write the lyrics for the songs. So I've had different interests. I mean, my interests are quite, I suppose, diverse. Mm-hmm. But when I was at school, my favorite subjects were English language, English literature, and history.
Oh, I love history. Yeah. What about siblings? Do you have any siblings?
I have one brother who is younger than I, so I'm the oldest.
Is he an author as well?
No, we are quite different in many ways, but nothing wrong with being different. But he has different interests and he pursues different things. I also have a half brother, because from my father's side of the family. Unfortunately, he has turned out to be the devil incarnate. But we might explore that later on.
Yes. And is he, I just want to know, because this kind of has context, I suppose, with what we'll talk about. Is he your father's son?
Correct.
Okay. Because your father was the abuser in your home.
Well, that's a difficult one to call, really, because from my perspective as a child, yes. But then there is something called emotional baiting. And I could walk into a situation where there was a massive argument or physical fight going on, but I wasn't privy to know what had happened prior.
Right.
So
that's amazing that you can have that mindset. That's amazing. A lot of people, I've not heard anybody say it in those sense of terms. You weren't privy to what happened before. And there is that emotional baiting. Some people, they just grab sides and that's all it is, right? It's that one. And somebody's at fault. So that you would say that really helps us open up to a different viewpoint.
Well, I was of that mindset, you know, as a child and as a teenager, hence my rabid interest in martial arts to protect my mother. But at the end of the day, with time and age and research comes a little bit of wisdom. And, you know, really, I mean, sometimes, yes, domestic violence, domestic abuse is a black and white issue in terms of, well, one person's the abuser, the other person is the victim. Even though I know a lot of people don't like the word victim, but that's if someone's abusing you, or then, you know, you're being abused effectively. Right. So as you kind of do more research and get more understanding, then you kind of understand it from maybe a different point of view. You know, not everything in life is black and white. It would be very easy in life if everything was binary, but life isn't like that. Right.
Well, let me just ask you this. So we mentioned your books, and love is such a tricky thing. Just the word love is a tricky thing, isn't it? So I'm married, but I can tell you right now, in today's day and age, I would never want to go back out onto that dating scene. I would not want to be a part of any of this world of love today. And it's complicated. It's complicated. So I'm wondering, what made you become so interested in this intricate, complicated world of love and relationship? What made you become a part of this?
Well, as you mentioned, my book is called How to Avoid Making the Big Relationship Mistakes. And I have made most of them, if not all of them. So initially the book started off as a quest of really trying to understand my journey at that particular moment in my life. And it just kind of blossomed from there, because I didn't really know how deep a topic or subject relationships are. It's only when I started to do the research, and I ended up doing 800 pages for the book draft, 5 years research, because it's like going down a rabbit hole. Well, how far down the rabbit hole do you want to go? You know, so the final published book came out at around 400 pages, which is quite a hefty
That's
book.
A big edit.
Yeah, that's a big edit. Thank the Lord. Thank the Lord for my lovely editor, Denise Roberts. Yes. So, so really the book, the first half of the book deals with self-development. You know, certain issues like that, process of self-discovery, self-esteem, emotional intelligence, the science of love, which is actually 2 chapters. Because there is a biochemical side to attraction.
Right.
You know, and being involved and being bonded with another person. So it's not necessarily all lovey-dovey, you know, Romeo and Juliet kind of situation. It's quite a deep topic. And one of the first chapters, actually, the first chapter is called Love Myths. Because a lot of us get programmed into believing these myths about love, you know, fueled by Romeo and Juliet and
right.
You know, movies, Hollywood movies, you know, Love at First Sight, Sleepless in Seattle, etc. But real life is rarely like that.
I think after you're in a relationship where it's even less than a year, but let's just say a year, realize that the fairy tale is just that. It's just a fairy tale.
Well, most relationships go through the honeymoon stage, you know, with the golden period, you know, as it's called, you know. So yeah, obviously, you know, your hormones are popping, you know, your oxytocin is flowing, you're bonding, etc. And then real life kicks in.
And then real life kicks in.
Yeah, you know, a year to 18 months is generally considered the honeymoon phase, the honeymoon period.
Well, so your first book is about personal development and healthy relationships, romantic relationships.
Well, the first part of the book, then the second part of the book gets into the nitty gritty of relationships, you know, like online dating, compatibility issues, compatibility hazards, relationship progression, you know, how a healthy relationship should progress. So, yeah, it covers a lot of ground.
A lot of ground, and everybody should get this book. I mean, we think we know things, and then we read something from an expert like yourself, and we realize we don't know much of anything. It's trial and error, but sometimes there's people out there, there's help that we can read, we can listen to. We don't have to go through so much error, and you help with that. Okay, I've been there in this. You've gone down the rabbit hole for some of us so that we don't have to do it. But you could probably write 100 books on this topic and still not cover all of it. Would you say so?
Well, the issue becomes, well, certainly for me with the first book, is what do you leave in and what do you take out? Because my editor had to go through 800 pages of material, and I'm a two-finger typist. I'm not, so at the end of the day, yeah, you have to decide really what are you going to include. I think the good thing for me was the material that was omitted from the first book. I've been able to use that for the forthcoming second book.
Right.
So the stuff that was left out has not necessarily been wasted.
Never wasted. And on that topic, your book coming out this year is about abusive relationships. Quite the opposite of the spectrum of the healthy development, healthy romantic relationships. It's quite the opposite. So before we get into that, let's talk about the personal development though, that side of things. I mean, it should be obvious to some of us, but it's downright difficult sometimes. It's really hard. So how do we create those personal boundaries for ourselves? You write about personal boundaries in your book. How do we create that?
Well, the first thing is to have a look at yourself, which is something a lot of people are reluctant or resistant to do. What I have observed is that people go into relationships, the relationship doesn't work out, and then they're busy pointing fingers saying, no, it's his fault or it's her fault, this hasn't worked out. But you have to kind of have enough self-awareness to actually look at yourself and say, well, how did I contribute to that? How did I negatively impact on that particular relationship? What did I do wrong? What baggage did I walk into that relationship with? Because what you'll tend to find is if someone's got like quite a lot of emotional baggage, that baggage will eventually come out in the relationship in the form of conflicts. So you will notice that certain people have relationship patterns. So their partners change, but the outcome doesn't, because the outcome is usually a relationship failure. And then they go looking for love somewhere else, and the same thing happens again. So it's just a pattern of behavior. So until that pattern is broken in terms of the individual, they're just going to carry on this carousel, on this merry-go-round, forever pointing the finger at the other person.
That's right. I say looking at your ugly. You have to look in the mirror and look at your own ugly, which nobody likes to do. It's painful sometimes. But in order to advance and become a healthier person so that you find healthier relationships, it's like a must-do. You have to look in the mirror and accept that you have ugly yourself.
Well, it's not necessarily always ugly. It may just be you have certain personality traits or certain personality tendencies that can make you probably vulnerable to becoming involved in a relationship that is not healthy. Yeah. So, for example, if you grow up in a home and you are the caregiver as a child, so say your parent has got a drink problem, a drug problem, a mental health problem, that child can end up being the caretaker. So the roles are reversed effectively. But then when they become adults, they have still got that mindset, which leads to codependency. So then they get into a relationship where they're always giving and caretaking their partner. Now, if their partner has got abusive tendencies, well, that's going to suit the abuser perfectly, because abusers are all about power and control and taking. And someone who's got codependent tendencies are givers. Just like someone who's like got strong empathic traits, you know, they're givers, but they're givers for a different reason, as it were. I often hear codependents and empaths compared, and there's no comparison in the sense that the motivation is different. I would say a codependent can be created as a child, but also a codependent can be created in an abusive relationship as well. Mm-hmm. Because I've seen, and it's happened to myself, where a person can be quite confident, have high self-esteem going into a relationship, but if they go into a relationship with an abuser, the first task of an abuser, the first objective is power and control. And the easiest way to control somebody is to lower their self-confidence, lower their self-esteem, and isolate them. That's one of the strategies of an abuser. They like to isolate their partner because that makes them easier to control because they haven't got the support network there.
Right. So let me just ask you this. So you don't think, and I'm trying to put this through my head, you cannot be codependent as well as a controller? Because I'm wondering, yeah, can you be both in the can you be that in one person, a controller and a codependent person?
Yes, you can. Unfortunately, for the codependent, they can seek to control by their giving.
Right.
But that's not necessarily going to work with an abuser, because they're still going to be taking all day long.
Right.
Yeah, so it is quite possible. Someone who's got codependent tendencies will try to control, because maybe part of their giving is actually a manipulation tactic to get their partner to do what they want them to do.
Because I'm thinking about it, and I'm just going to be very vulnerable and transparent at this moment. I think I'm better. I don't think I'm as codependent. When I was younger, I was codependent, but I'm also a controller, and I'm working on that. I think because of my background and how I grew up in situations, I needed to have that control because it was always so out of control. And I'm also codependent because when I feel or see people in those kind of roles, I want to be that, help them because I've been there. That's why I'm thinking, I think I'm kind of both, and maybe both of them are a little unhealthy. Codependent and controller.
Well, I look at things on a spectrum, because as you know, I study and help people who've been involved with narcissists. So with narcissism, that's measured on a spectrum. So basically, the more traits a person has, so there are 9 traits. I'll do a quick explanation. So there are 9 traits for to be officially diagnosed as a narcissist. Okay, so for example, strong sense of entitlement, arrogance, always envious, etc. But you know, if someone wanted to find out the 9 traits, and just Google it online, 9 traits of a narcissist, that's all there. So basically, it's measured on a spectrum, and we all have spectrums of behavior. You know, it's really just a question of, you know, is it damaging other people? That is always my litmus test. You know, is the behavior or the attitude damaging to somebody else? You know, because obviously we all like to have control of our lives. I mean, being in control of our lives makes us feel secure. You know, nice to have enough money in the bank, enough food in your fridge, etc.
Right.
But when someone turns into a control freak, then basically what they're trying to do, they're trying to manage their insecurities by controlling somebody else.
Right. That makes sense. And do you think it's the same guidelines? It's the same for men and women?
Well, yes. Yes. I mean, the thing sometimes, well, there's a couple of things to unpack there. First of all, society often gives women who are abusers a free card, or get out of jail free card, for want of a better phrase, because that's basically not society's view of women. So there are a lot of guys out there who are being abused and suffering in silence, and the guys have the problem in the sense that as men, we are not socialized or orientated as children to express our feelings. So it's for guys, generally it's, as children, big boys don't cry,
Right.
Man up, etc. So there's something called the guy code. So guys, generally, they'll talk about work, sports, cars, anything to avoid actually talking about their emotions, because they don't want to be judged. They don't want to be seen as being less masculine as their peers. But then that leads to the other problem. The other problem being that the suicide rate for men approximately is 2/3 higher than it is for women. Right. So when you do the research tells me that more women attempt suicide, but more men succeed at suicide.
Wow.
So, for example, I had a childhood friend. We were always in and out of each other's house, etc., as children. And I think 2014. Yeah, 2014, he went to a car park, high-rise car park, and just stepped off the roof. And that was that. So in certain senses, you can say, well, a suicide attempt can be a cry for help, because someone might take a load of pills, but There's a possibility they may wake up. If you step off a car park roof, you can't say halfway down, oh, I've changed my mind.
Right. And I think there has been, and there is, and maybe there always, I don't know, there are people who use that as an abusive tactic as well in their relationships, who are constantly talking about they're gonna end their life, or they attempt many times as a way of controlling that relationship as well. Mm-hmm. I've known that in my personal life, of people who use that, and that's an abusive tactic. Would you not say so? Somebody who's always threatening to take their life or attempting to take all these pills to control that relationship.
Well, it is a abuse tactic, or it can be an abuse tactic, but it's also a control tactic. Right. Because at the end of the day, if someone's threatening to take their own life because you've left them, for example, well, it's quite possible they may do it, but in my experience and in my observations, very rare they follow through.
It's a control tactic.
Yeah, so it's like a control tactic at the end of the day. So again, if we go back to narcissists, so the narcissist basically has a relationship cycle. So the cycle is idealize, devalue, discard. They may well come back around, which is called the hoover. Now, this is where the hoover is relevant in the sense of they're now trying to get back in to the ex-partner's life. And one of the things they will do is pretend to be sick or pretend to be suicidal, pulling on the heartstrings to say, I know I'm suffering, I really need you, I'm distraught, etc. But that's just a ploy. And once a person gets sucked back in, that same abusive relationship cycle will just go around again, probably the next time faster.
So how do we avoid that? So we're working on ourselves. We're getting ourselves healthy. We're recognizing some of our own pitfalls, and we think, okay, I've been working on myself. I'm doing well. I'm doing okay. Now it's time for me to go out and find that special someone. So then what qualities should we be looking for in a partner to avoid some of these pitfalls? Is it even possible?
Right. Well, again, in my book, I've got a chapter called 7 Essential Character Traits. Basically, the things you should be looking for in a potential partner. So I always say, well, when we go shopping, generally, we make a list. We make a list with the objective of coming home with what we went out to get. Well, if you're on a dating scene, a list is no different. I always advise people, write a list. What type of person are you looking for? That's the first thing. You're looking for someone who's like healthy, got good self-esteem, honest, has integrity, all of those, positive things. But unfortunately, you could be looking for those things, but you also need to understand how to spot red flags.
Right.
Because the reality is, there are a lot of people out there walking around with undiagnosed personality disorders. So they're chronically, mentally and emotionally unstable. They've just never been diagnosed. And they're going through their life, damaging other people. So you have to kind of be aware of what potential red flags could be. And those red flags should be your deal breakers, i.e. not acceptable. So then we go back to healthy personal boundaries, what is acceptable for you as a person and what is not. So it's kind of like a 2-tier kind of approach that I recommend. Obviously work on yourself, make sure you've got healthy self-esteem, make sure that you're not carrying any baggage from the past that's going to impact, your next relationship. But also, clue yourself up in terms of, what potential red flags look like. Because otherwise, if you just ignore a red flag, and worse still, if you ignore your intuition, because I always say, trust your gut instinct.
That's right.
Because I know in my own life, every time I have ignored my intuition, I have paid.
Yeah.
Sometimes heavily.
Right.
So sometimes you may not necessarily have the evidence, may not be anything particularly obvious. You might just feel that something's a bit off. Well, if you get that feeling, pay attention.
Pay attention, yeah. Well, the thing is, Nigel, sometimes we say, well, I found myself in this, or you hear people say that I found myself in these unhealthy relationships. I don't suspect that we knowingly or wantingly go into relationships thinking, oh, it's going to be abusive or toxic. So we find ourselves in these situations. We ignored the red flags. We're ignoring possibly our own intuition, our own gut feeling. How do we spot that? Because people who are codependent, sometimes that nurturing aspect of them comes out and they think that it's okay, I can help them with this or I can change this in them. And then before you know it, you're so deep into the relationship when you should have been able to say bye-bye a long time ago. I guess I got to find the question for that. What I'm saying, we don't find ourselves in unhealthy relationships more often than not. Sometimes we do. People change. They're not who we thought they were. Some of those red flags, what would they be?
Well, you've kind of got a little bit down the road a bit there. Because first of all, you have to understand with abusers, they don't come with a label on their forehead saying, well, I'm an abuser. They come with a lot of charisma often, a lot of charm often. There's something called love bombing. So in love bombing, basically, the abuser showers the person with lots of love and gifts and attention, etc. Now, that's to suck the person in. It's only when they're in, and part of that love bombing strategy is it will make a person ignore their intuition. It will make them ignore the red flags because they're too busy getting swept off their feet. Right. It's only when they're in, and then the true behavior starts to come out, the true nature of the abuser starts to come out. They're already emotionally invested. They're emotionally bonded. And then the other thing that I see a lot of is trauma bonding. Sometimes it's called Stockholm syndrome.
Right.
So the story of Stockholm is there was a bank robbery in the 70s. X amount of people were taken hostage. I think the situation lasted a week. Anyway, the long and short of it is that there were female hostages taken. Now, one female hostage wanted to marry one of the hostage takers. Another one of the women, they posted bail for another one of the hostage takers. So, but basically, trauma bonding is caused by what they call intermittent reinforcement, right? So it's someone treats you nice, then they treat you nasty. So it's a cycle of like hot and cold behavior. So the person at the end of this, eventually, they end up biochemically attached to their abuser. That's one. And then two, they're always forever chasing that golden period or that honeymoon phase where everything was wonderful and lovely. But during that love bombing phase, what's happening is, again, on a biochemical level, all your good feeling hormones are getting triggered. You know, your dopamine and, you know, your adrenaline to an extent, your oxytocin. So oxytocin is a hormone which is known as the cuddling hormone, which basically bonds one person to another person. So women have more oxytocin, men have more testosterone. Yeah, so a woman produces oxytocin, say if they have an orgasm or when they're breastfeeding their child. They can even produce it when they're holding hands with their partner. Hence, that's why it's called the bonding right. Kind of hormone or the cuddling hormone. So there's a lot of emotional, but also biochemical things going on, not only during the honeymoon phase or the love bombing phase, but there's also stuff going on. If it turns out to be an abusive relationship, there are, again, biochemical issues going on as well. And if you're trauma bonded to someone, it can be very difficult to leave them. If I had £1, because obviously I live in the UK, so we've got pounds in. So if I had £1 for every comment I see online saying, oh, I really miss him, I know he's abusive, but, and guys too, they say, oh, I really miss her. I know she really treated me badly, but I still want her back. They have been trauma bonded. Because this is now after the relationships have ended. So, but they've been trauma bonded, but they don't understand what it is. I can see what it is, because obviously on a logical basis, why would a person miss an ex-partner who has abused them? So on the surface, it doesn't make sense. But when you understand trauma bonding, it makes perfect sense.
I've never heard of trauma bonding, and it makes perfect sense. The way you're saying it makes perfect sense. You know, and I've heard you mention before, and in your book, values play a part in building successful relationships. So do you think that we should look for the similar values? Do you think that, speak just a little bit about the values. How important is it in a successful relationship?
In my opinion, very. So you've got to look at values and beliefs, or shared values and beliefs. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking, oh, we share the same interests. Oh, we like horror movies, or we like sports, or we like kicking back and watching Netflix. Those are interests.
Right.
You can't really build a solid relationship going forward on shared interests. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying that for me, it's more important to have shared values and beliefs, because that's a more solid foundation.
Right. So,
for example, if your belief is, okay, you have Christian beliefs, you're a strong Christian, for example. Well, getting involved with an atheist may not be the best move, because obviously you don't share the same values or beliefs, for that matter. And you might have the same values in terms of, oh, it's not cool to be cruel to somebody else. But if you've got different beliefs, that could be an issue. Not to say that someone who's a Christian and someone who's a Buddhist, for example, they can't form a healthy relationship. It really depends on how respectful they are of each other's beliefs at the end of the day.
Right.
But if you've got someone who is, staunchly Christian, and you've got someone who's not really that interested in that could be a problem, because I'm only using Christianity as an example. But, but if someone, is a staunch Christian and, so they're going to church every Sunday, etc., and their partner's not interested,
Right.
that could cause conflict, really, when you look at it. And then the other part of that conflict could be, Wesley Snipes has a saying. I love sayings, by the way. The person who enters a relationship seeking to change the other person sets the scene for a great deal of conflict, which is another mistake often people make, is they go into a relationship, then they try and change the other person. As opposed to, if you had shared values and beliefs in the first place, then that wouldn't be necessary. Not that it should be necessary anyway.
Yeah, I like that. Interests are not the same as values. Interests are not the same as values and morals. I think a lot of people confuse those and mix it up. They're not the same. And I really like the way you form this for us. Interests are not the same as values. I think we need to delve more into the person that we're interested in when we're thinking of getting into a relationship. Think more. I think we just go on our emotions, our first set of emotions first, like, oh, he's cute or she's pretty. And we go, I mean, that's normal, obviously.
Yeah.
But I think we need to think more in order to avoid some of these abusive relationships that people find themselves in more and more. We got to think more about that. We got to get more healthier inside. So I love that you say that. Now, your book, How to Avoid Abusive Relationships, A Guide to Toxic Personalities. We've discussed a few of them already, but give us a few of these toxic personalities that are right out front in our face, that we don't have to find ourselves in later on. It is a guide to toxic personalities.
Well, again, we go back to red flags, really. We go back to behaviors. So, for me, I look at things like, say I encounter somebody and they are extremely thin-skinned. Well, that would be a red flag to me. Or if someone's selfish, or if someone's overly arrogant, or if someone's prone to emotional baiting. There are a variety of red flags that you can look for before. But at the end of the day, I don't want to encourage people to be walking around being paranoid.
Right.
I advocate people being aware. There's a difference between being aware of certain things and, walking around thinking that everyone's an abuser or a potential abuser, because that's no way to live your life at the end of the day. It's just about being aware. That's why I always say to people, don't listen to me. There's a ton of information online you can find out about potential abusers, red flags. Obviously, you've got to be aware of where you're getting your information from, because obviously not everything online is necessarily correct. But there's plenty of great information online where you can, just pay attention, because it's easier to get into a relationship, obviously, or even get married than to get out of it. Because one of the most difficult things is getting yourself out of an abusive relationship, because it's not just a question of emotional or physical abuse. It can also be financial abuse, for example. So if the abuser controls all of the resources, well, obviously it's going to be more difficult for a person to leave. If they, and then if you put on top of that, if they're trauma bonded and the abuser has control of the finances, well, that's double difficult, and so it go, and so it can go on. And certainly here in the UK, on average, 2 women a week are murdered by a partner or ex-partner.
So domestic violence.
Yeah, and that's gone up since COVID's hit us all across the world, because what we are finding now is there are a lot of people who are trapped with their abuser because of the lockdown. So it's more difficult for them to reach out for help. On the other side of the coin, the support services have been hit by COVID. So the people who work at the support places like, domestic violence shelters, etc., their staff has been diminished because, again, COVID.
Right.
So it's kind of like a double whammy, basically.
Yeah, here too in Canada, I think all over the world, the domestic violence, child abuse it's gone through the roof.
Definitely.
Like you said, we don't want to walk around being paranoid and looking at everybody as they're an abuser first. But as your book mentions, we do want to learn how to avoid abusive relationships, how to avoid them. And just like you said, we got to be aware. Just pay attention to those little signs. Don't dismiss them. Don't get paranoid about them, but don't dismiss them. Keep them. And sometimes if you have to write it down, like say you're starting to date a person, a guy or a girl, write those things down. Like you said, right? Just be aware. See how often it happens. If it happens too often, well, you probably have your answer right there. Right? Like we have to become aware on how to avoid them. I don't think it's a conversation many people have. Like once we're in it, we discuss it, like women more than men, like you've mentioned. But Nigel, you're giving us tools. You're putting things out there for us to say, okay, these things are happening in the world. How do I avoid this? How do I not become a victim of abuse?
Well,
I don't want to be a survivor of abuse. I don't want to get into it in the first place. So you're giving us tools for that.
Well, I do my best. I mean, at the end of the day, the best advice I can give is don't rush into a relationship in the first place. Steve Harvey had a book several years ago. What was it called again? Act Like a Lady, Think Like a Man. And in that book, he has a theory or a practice, basically the 90-day rule. And his view is, well, when you start a new job, generally, you go on probation. You don't just get the job straight away, do you? You have your 90 days or whatever probation period it may be. And then if you pass your probation, then you're given the job permanently. Well, dating to me is not any different, really. Instead of just rushing in, take your time. Now, I do say in my first book, I've got a chapter on dating, online dating, etc. So, meet somebody new. You don't want to be giving them what I call the interview date when you're giving them like a zillion questions, in one date. But at the same time, if you're dating over a period of time, you can ask certain questions as you're going along, and just take your time, really. Because as I said before, it's easy to get into a relationship, but getting out sometimes can be an absolute nightmare. It really can be. And not to say that the love at first sight can't happen or it doesn't exist. There's always exceptions to the rule. But for me, I say to myself, well, at the end of the day, you can't follow the Hollywood model of, your eyes met across a crowded room and there were fireworks, etc., etc. Well, yeah, that can happen, but not necessarily the best course of action if you're looking for a healthy relationship.
No, and don't forget Hollywood. If we're looking at the Hollywood status, like you're saying, just go. Most of them don't last past a couple months. They get in one argument and they can't handle each other anymore. So don't Hollywood, but but you're also an advocate for victims and survivors of abuse, Nigel. Why? Why did you decide to become such an advocate? I know you're an expert in your field in many things. You're a voice for many. What made you become an advocate?
Well, I think that goes back to my childhood experiences. I'm quite an empathic person. I don't like to see people suffering. Also, as an adult, people tend to gravitate to me for advice. I have no idea why. But I could meet somebody for the first time and they'll be telling me their life story within 10 minutes. I don't know what that is about me. So I've always been helping people or trying to advise people. And that was part of my motivation to write the book as well, because I thought, well, if I had everything in one place, like a book, I could say, okay, look, that's my book. You want to find out about ABC? There you go. So yes, and then I started a group on Facebook prior to publishing my book to get feedback on my writing. Well, that was the basic motivation for starting the group. But then I found people were joining the group assuming it was a support group. So I said to my friend, I said, well, why don't we create a support group then? And then if they join this group thinking it's a support group, then we can signpost them and we can say, well, we've got a support. This is not a support group, but we have a support group over here quite happily. You can join there. And that's how really the online group, Reflections on Abusive Relationship, started. And that was 9 years ago. So it'll be 10 years, 10 years next year. So obviously over the course of the last 9 years, I read stories every day. As you said, the group's got 21,000 plus members now. And again, I'm all about raising awareness. So I make sure that I post relevant articles to that group, daily, but also other groups, because that's not the only group that I belong to. Yeah, I co-created it with a friend, but I belong to other support groups as well. So when I'm on Facebook, for example, they're going to come up on my news feed, as it were. So I read stories every day, and it can get quite overwhelming at times, but I've had to train myself to observe and not to absorb.
Right.
Because if you absorb, especially if I'm quite a sensitive guy. So, if you're seeing the doom and gloom every day, people suffering every day, then, if you're not emotionally healthy, if you don't have kind of strategies to de-stress yourself, then you're going to end up quite possibly burning yourself out.
Yeah.
And I've been there and I've been through a burnout before, not due to being an advocate for abuse, but I was a unison shop steward. Basically, I was a union rep, effectively. So again, helping people, advising people, supporting people, etc. So it's always been kind of like a part of my life, kind of like one way or another. It's just, I suppose it's just more, I wouldn't say formal, but more formal now, more official now. But I've always been the kind of the go-to guy. Go and ask Nigel. but then, which is cool, I know, because if I don't know something, I'll find out. I'll do because one of the things about myself, I'm a natural researcher. I'm very curious about everything, really. If I don't know something, I think, what's that about then? Let's have a look, see what we can find out. So I've always been that way inclined, really. And I don't see the point in having a load of information in my head and it's not helping anybody.
Right.
What good is that? It's not a question of, Nigel knows X, Y, Z. Is like, well, who is this information going to help, or how can it help somebody? So that's what that's really my motivation, is really just raising awareness, and even within the raising awareness, I'm learning things as well. I don't know everything, so I come across certain situations online in terms of abusive relationships, or someone may ask a question and I might think, I'm not quite sure about that. So I'll go and do the research. And research in this day and age, it's not like when I was growing up, you had to get the book or go to the library. You know,
The Dewey system.
Yeah, once you're kind of like looking at credible sources of information. So like I like online, who do I like? Psychology Today. You know, I often refer to their articles, for example, because they've got credible people, you know, who write the articles, you know, psychologists, psychiatrists, etc. And there's quite a few other really good websites you can get good information from.